No one wants sad vegetables like these, right? These sprouts were roasted and they're all over the place. You've got this piece right here. There's not really any browning. It's not going to taste great. I've got another one here. Okay color, but it's mush. Gross. Maybe not gross, but not good. There are a couple of perfect ones, like this little piece. Beautiful uniform browning. The cook is nice. How do we get all of our sprouts to look like this? We reverse sear them. Reverse searing is a term that's typically associated with meat, usually flat cuts like steaks or chops. When you reverse sear, you're gently cooking the meat at a low temp until it's mostly done. Then you sear the outside to get great browning. This two-step approach, it's valuable because it minimizes the portion of meat that gets overcooked. For more details, you can check out my video on how to cold sear. Just as we would with meat, we want to cook the inside of our vegetables first and then brown the outside. The most efficient way to cook the inside is to use steam. Then we just need to crank the temp and use enough oil to make sure that the heat is getting to the vegetables efficiently. But before we can get to any of that, let's talk about an often overlooked part of the process, the prep. Unlike meat, pretty much all vegetables come to us whole, and so they're going to need some trimming and cutting. The two keys are to create flat edges and to make sure the pieces are all about the same size. Fennel, cabbage, and Brussels sprouts are some of my favorite vegetables to reverse sear. There's nothing tricky about this. We want flat sides that can sit flush against a skillet or sheet pan because this is where we're going to get most of the browning. So I have my sprouts here, they're trimmed. I like to make sure they're compact and round. The taller they get, the more stemmy they are, and it's just not as good. But cutting them in half is pretty much as easy as that. So for the cabbage, I want to get 8 wedges out of this, and I want to make sure that the core stays intact so the leaves don't fall apart as I'm working with it. They're usually pretty centered, and I just kind of lay it down and just cut straight down. Make sure you turn them flat side down. It's going to make everything a lot easier because they won't rock. And because I want to make sure that there's enough core to hold these two halves together, I actually like to kind of turn it up and set the knife along that edge. Kind of eyeball it before I slice. So next up, fennel. Got 2 heads here, and I know how divisive fennel can be. If you're one of those people who doesn't love that anisey flavor of fresh fennel, you got to try it roasted. That anisey aroma, it really kind of blows off during the cooking process, and what you're left with is super creamy and delicious. Just like with the cabbage, there's a core. The core is going to hold all the pieces in place, and we want to make sure that we divide this up so that every wedge has enough core. Just like before, flat side down, halve, and halve again. Whatever vegetables you're reverse searing, you want to make sure that the pieces are all about the same size. They don't have to be identical, but they need to be close because that's going to let them all finish cooking at the same time. Prepping the veg for roasting also means thinking about the fat and the salt. Fat prevents sticking and it helps with browning while the salt seasons. The core technique is going to remain the same, but you do need to tweak that technique to suit the vegetable and the equipment. This Brussels sprouts recipe is courtesy of Annie Petito. The cut sprouts, they can go right in the pan we're going to cook them in. There's no need to dirty a bowl. I am going to take the time to arrange them cut side down because that's where the browning happens. It's pretty typical for the sprouts to not quite fit in the pan and they'll kind of come up the sides of the pan a little bit. That's totally fine. They're going to shrink as they cook and they'll fit nicely by the time we get to the browning part. So to help those cut sides get good browning, I need to add a nice amount of oil. I am going to skip the salt because these are going to get dressed after they're cooked. So fennel's got thick layers and Keith Dresser has a great trick for seasoning them evenly. I've got a little bowl here. I'm going to add some water and salt. I've whisked my water and salt together to make a brine. And these fennel wedges, they're going to go right in there and we'll give them a quick toss. Quick bit of pepper and a nice drizzle of oil. Now that they're seasoned and oiled, I'm just going to arrange them on my sheet pan. Now that these are arranged, this is almost ready to go. I do want to hold on to this brine for later. Andrea Geary's roasted cabbage also calls for a sheet pan. This time, instead of just tossing those cabbage wedges in a bowl, I need to be a little bit more careful. I'm just going to arrange them on the pan. Rather than drizzling kind of randomly, I'm going to actually use a brush to put that oil exactly where I want it to be. Because there's so much more leaf here for the core to hold on to, you have to just be a little bit more careful. Now we're just seasoning with salt, and after I get all of these in place, I'll flip them over and oil and salt the second side. Okay, our veg is ready for steaming. Steaming is an easy and effective way to cook vegetables, but you can't have steam without water. That water can come from the vegetables or you can add it. How do you know if you need to add water? Unfortunately, there isn't an easy formula. That said, anything that needs more time to cook through, whether it's because it's really dense or you've cut it into large pieces, it's going to benefit from added water. These sprouts have thin leaves that are quick to cook through. As they cook, heat damages their cells and water gets released. We just need to pop a lid on this pan to trap that water. Cabbage also has thin leaves that cook quickly, so we can just cover the sheet pan tightly with foil to trap the water once it's released. Fennel's got thicker layers that take more time to cook. These wedges are going to require a little bit more water than the fennel contains, so we'll pour the extra brine from the bowl right into the pan. Now we can cover this with foil. Without the lid or foil, steam would just fly off. On the stove, that's going to mean that the sprouts are going to brown on the bottom, but the rounded sides that are pointing up, they're going to stay pretty close to raw unless we toss them occasionally as they cook. But that's going to cause a new problem. The flat sides that we want to brown, they're not going to be seeing the pan for long enough to get good color. In the oven, the tops and sides of the cabbage and fennel, they do see heat, but it's a dry heat, and that's going to make the surfaces leathery and dry. But with steam, we can avoid all of that. Here's why. Steam is just water, right? Well, yes and no. When you've got liquid water in a pan, those water molecules are loosely bonded to each other. If you pump enough heat into that liquid water, they're going to rise as steam. These free-floating water molecules, they can't escape the pan though because of the lid. Eventually, they're going to land on something that's cooler, and that's when that's when the science happens. What happens? Heat naturally flows from hot things to cool things. So the heat that was in those water molecules, it's going to get transferred to the food. That water molecule no longer has the energy to fly around freely, so it's going to condense on the food, where it'll eventually kind of flow down into the bottom of the pan, absorb heat, and fly up again. That's how steaming works. We're using water to deliver heat to the bits of food that aren't in contact with the hot pan. And the condensing water also keeps surfaces from drying out. Depending on what you're cooking, steaming is going to take between 5 to 20 minutes. Once the veg is mostly cooked, that steam, it's no longer helpful. In fact, it's going to keep the temperatures in the pan too low for browning. This is when we want to ditch the lid and let all of that steam escape. That allows temperatures to rise high enough for Maillard browning and caramelization. For our sprouts, we're just going to remove the lid and keep an eye on them as they brown. It's going to take about 2-3 minutes. For our fennel and cabbage, we remove the foil, let the first side brown, before flipping to brown the second side. The key to great browning isn't just getting rid of the water though. We also want to make sure that the heat from the pan is getting transferred to the food efficiently. Cooking can cause foods to change their shape, and things that were flat when they were raw, they're not going to be quite as flat once they're cooked. So what we need is something to fill in the gaps between the metal pan and the food. That thing, it's oil. Just as we use water to transfer heat to the bits of food that weren't touching the pan, we're going to use oil to do the same thing here. Oil won't vaporize at the temperatures we're working with, so the only parts that it's transferring heat to are the cut sides that are really close but not quite touching the pan. I'm just going to dress my veggies, and then let's get to tasting. So here's what we end up with. 3 plates of gorgeous vegetables with beautiful browning, and they're cooked perfectly. Let's start with the sprouts. It's so nice to not have to pick and choose the best ones. They all look great. So after they were done cooking, I dressed them with a maple vinaigrette, and on top, just a sprinkling of chopped smoked almonds. It's awesome. Smoky, sweet, and fantastic. Check out this cabbage. I haven't swooshed anything in, I don't know, 13, 14 years, but I still got it. It's kind of nice to need a knife for your vegetables. They deserve that. I don't know if you've ever had perfectly cooked, perfectly browned cabbage, but you've got to try it. That cabbage is kind of sweet, it's delicate, it's tender. The little sesame seeds and scallions, they're just the perfect accompaniment. Last up are roasted fennel. I know how divisive fennel can be, but everyone who thinks they don't like fennel, you've got to give this a try as well. It's just transformed by this cooking method. Super creamy, delicately sweet, a hint of that savory, charry bitterness that complements all those sweet flavors. The bulbs are just bringing this kind of soft vegetable creaminess. It's fantastic. I love this method for cooking vegetables, and I think you're gonna love it too. Check out americastestkitchen.com for recipes where we've done the work of figuring out all of the details for you. You could reverse your vegetables like cauliflower, broccoli, delicata squash. What vegetables do you think would benefit from being cooked this way? Let me know in the comments which vegetables you'd reverse sear.